Kia ora koutou. Welcome to the Carriage & Partners webinar series. My name is Renisa Peterson, and I am a consultant with the firm. As part of our vision to transform the leadership landscape, we have been working on a series of leadership events, and in embracing these current digital times, are launching these online. Thank you to everyone who has been attending our webinar series over the last 3 weeks. We are grateful for the positive feedback on these webinars, so thank you to all who completed the survey or contacted us. We are especially glad to see the dialogue that the webinars have sparked, given the first topic was on leadership and innovation in times of crisis, and the second was on developing the next generation of chief executives for Aotearoa, which leveraged lessons learned from qualitative research completed by Carriage & Partners in 2019, whereby we connected with over 40 senior leaders from different sectors to get their perspectives on talent development for CEOs. We are delighted you are joining us today for our third webinar topic regarding CEO succession planning and how it can be managed effectively. We will also be uploading a recording of this webinar to our website and also share the slide deck, so no need to worry about writing too many notes. For context on who is with us online as part of this community, we have over 140 people, and 18% of you are CEOs, 23% are professional directors, including chairs, 11% are chief people officers, and the rest are a cohort of senior executives from a broad range of sectors. Haere mai. Akin to last week, there are also a couple of leaders joining from Australia. Welcome to this Trans-Tasman bubble. Some housekeeping matters to begin with. Firstly, you have all joined this webinar on mute, and please rest assured you're not on video, so you can sit back and relax. You will remain on mute by default, so no need to stress about background noise either. Secondly, we encourage you to participate by asking questions throughout this session. On the bottom of your screen, there is a Zoom chat function, Q&A. Please type in your questions, and we will address the most popular ones during our panel session, which I will expand on shortly. Please can we request that you send your questions using the Q&A function instead of the Zoom chat function. Thirdly, we wanted to share the structure of our webinar today so you know what to expect. Following introductions, Claire Dennison and Peter Kerridge will be delivering a presentation and screen share with us all. At the conclusion of this, we will all reconvene for a Q&A panel session with Chiwe Kwan. Peter is our founding partner and created the business in 2005. He works across all our practices, including search, governance, and leadership. Beyond Carriage & Partners, Peter's commitment to New Zealand is also demonstrated as trustee on the board of the Graham Dingle Foundation, a Fab 50 member of the B Institute, and as an ambassador for Leadership New Zealand. Claire is a partner with our business, and she leads the governance practice, managing board appointments, board reviews, and governance development work for a range of clients. She has appointed chairs, non-executive directors, and trustees, and she has worked with many individual executives and directors, advising them on their governance portfolio. She has also hosted global thought leaders in a range of governance development events. Previously, Claire worked in strategy, consulting, and project management roles. Please welcome Claire and Peter.
Thanks very much, Renisa, and welcome to everybody. Welcome to today's webinar on Chief Executive Succession. We hope today we'll share with you some insights from across our business, from our three practices: governance, leadership, and executive search, and also from some global thought leaders. It will be a rapid run through of some areas that we would hope to cover in a one-day seminar. With the challenges of getting people together in a room at the moment and also doing a one-day seminar remotely, we hope that the highlights that we'll share with you today will provide good food for thought. So the goals of this session: we hope to inform you, bringing our experiences of over 125 different chief executive succession processes. We hope to inspire and trigger some ideas for you to create some positive change within your own organisations. And we hope to challenge. Learning is often best done when we're made to feel a little bit uncomfortable. So in the nicest possible way, we hope that some of what we say today challenges you. Before we get started on the content, we thought it might be useful to pose a couple of questions and ask that you ponder these just for a moment. Firstly, who's responsible for chief executive succession? Secondly, in a business as usual setting, how many hours per year should you devote to chief executive succession? And thirdly, how many potential chief executives should a board meet with each year? Let's take a look at these. Firstly, in terms of responsibility, many of you may have thought of the chief executive or perhaps the whole board. Others may have thought about a committee, such as the nominations committee or the remuneration committee. Or some of you may have thought about the human resources officer, head of HR. All of these answers are probably right. And whilst all of these individuals play important roles in a chief executive succession process, we want to be clear that it is the board who owns the chief executive succession process. So going on to the second question, how many hours per year should you devote to chief executive succession? Interesting possibly to juxtapose this question alongside how many hours a board might devote to discussing the chief executive's remuneration, for example. And of course, in reality, it will vary. However, the common theme is that it's probably more hours than you think, and likely to be more than you're currently devoting to this exercise. And finally, how many potential chief executives should a board meet with each year? And for some, this might sound a horrifying thought, but consider that 2/3 of US companies meet at least 2 to 3 potential chief executive candidates each year, just as part of doing business. For us, chief executive succession is not just a search. In some cases, it won't involve a search at all, where, for example, the internal succession pipeline has been strongly developed. However, where it does require a search, we say it shouldn't be a panic buy. What do we mean by that? Of course, there will be circumstances where an unplanned executive of a chief executive will happen, for example, through illness, possibly through their own volition, or even through internal or external pressure to do so. But regardless of the circumstances, we would argue that prior thinking and planning is required and will help the process immensely. The best organisations in the world that we observe spend time developing their internal talent, whilst also knowing the quality of the external talent in the marketplace, and having a view or even taking control of when the chief executive leaves. Now, this may be a contentious point in New Zealand, where often the chief executive will decide by themselves rather than through mutual agreement with a board. We'd say there are advantages in controlling the timing, even if there are no internal successors and the board knows it has to look outside for a new chief executive. So why do some boards avoid having conversations about chief executive succession? Well, possibly, unlike some more rational discussions, such as for a capital investment proposal, for example, chief executive succession is hard in that it does force boards to confront some of the emotional and political dynamics at play. Also, some boards struggle to find the time. Just a normal course of board activity, we find many boards struggle to spend time on the more strategic and long-term initiatives and get caught up in the operational and day-to-day. And, you know, luckily, chief executive succession processes don't happen very frequently. And so many board members may lack the skill set or even the experience to conduct such a process. Others think that a phone call to their favourite executive search company will solve the problem and effectively will just kick the can down the road. While in other cases, we find that the chief executive might dominate the board. They'll say that they've got everything under control and the board can step back at the end of the conversation. Yet it is commonly referred to as the most important role of a board. So why is it so important? The phrase, "it's the most important decision a board will ever meet," will be found on most director development programs. And that's because it is more than just the transition of a leader. When a chief executive appointment goes well, it will lead to so many different advantages for the organisation. New opportunities for growth, opportunities to strengthen culture, drive development, and so forth. It's a critical business continuity issue. And yet, when boards are surveyed about this, usually more than half will rate themselves as ineffective at this activity. And the cost of getting it wrong is huge. The wrong leader can lead to all sorts of issues, such as hits to the share price, the organisation losing momentum, reputational damage, and destroying trust in the organisation, which can take a long time to get back. A study from PwC in 2014 estimated that the economic cost of getting it wrong across global companies was as much as $100 billion. Another study looked at investment decisions and found that 1/3 of all investment decisions are related to the reputation of the chief executive. 39% of investors would sell shares based on the reputation of the CEO, whereas only 15% of investors would buy shares based on the reputation of the chief executive. And in a Harvard Business School study, 40% of executives that either changed jobs or promoted would fail in the first 18 months. And this is a figure that's held steady for more than 15 years. So hopefully we've established the importance of the chief executive succession and why it's so hard. The rest of the presentation, Peter and I will talk through some of the considerations to bear in mind when embarking on such an exercise. So who is your next chief executive? Does your organisation have a view? If you take an analogy from business continuity planning, I'm guessing that many of your organisations would have a plan for what to do if a piece of critical infrastructure failed. So why not have a plan for replacing the chief executive? Given the importance of the task and the tendency that we've discussed to delay these discussions, we would emphasise the importance of having a plan. It'd be useful if this plan laid out the process that needs to follow, the timelines, the responsibilities of who's involved, the goals of the process, the cadence of discussion at board meetings, and how it links to the talent development programme. The ideal time to start a chief executive succession process is actually at the appointment of the chief executive. This is an ideal time to set expectations around their role in succession development and how it will be reported. It's also useful for the board to then develop the process in terms of how it then links into the chief executive performance reviews and how they're assessing external talent. But if that didn't happen at the appointment of your current chief executive, then now is really the time to start. Market conditions are dynamic, of course, and so it's important that succession discussions and the process and the thinking around succession is dynamic too. And that helps to keep looking at potential candidates and making sure that they are still relevant. A common mistake when embarking on a chief executive succession process is for boards to rush into deciding what the skills and capabilities are that are required without stepping back and thinking about the context. Before we think about who, we need to agree what will these individuals need to achieve. What's the vision and direction for the business? What is the strategy and the culture required to achieve the long-term goals? It's here when we're talking about the skills and experience and the thinking, and particularly the personal attributes where cultural fit comes in. We prefer to think about cultural add. How will the new chief executive add to the organisation? What requirements would be useful to take the organisation forward. Looking at it like this and considering the context will help further down the line when we get to the narrow end of the process and many emotional and political dynamics come into play that helps to keep the process objective. Here's an example of a partially completed chief executive matrix. When this kind of exercise is completed, it would normally lead to quite a long wish list of asks. So the key here is to ensure that you force rank the requirements, and then it's important to focus in on the top 5 or 6 priorities. Interestingly, when an exercise like this is done, industry experience criteria rarely comes out as a must-have. Now I'm going to pass on to Peter, who's going to take us through the rest of the presentation.
Thank you, Claire. The next thing we'd like to talk about is forming a view of the performance of your current chief executive. In the course of the 125 or so chief executive succession processes that we've been involved in, it's interesting to note that most organizations have a much more favorable view of the performance of their incumbent at the point we start the process than they do at the point we finish the process. So the boards start to discover the things that perhaps weren't quite so rosy. So our contention is that boards do need to be less rose-tinted sometimes about their chief executive. Of course, support them, but actually the best way you can support them is by having a robust and objectively formed view of their performance so that you can make sure that potentially future board appointments are crafted to ensure that additional skills are brought to that board management team, and indeed you can support your chief executive with executive team hires that again cover areas they're less strong in. So beware of deifying your chief executive. Many boards still actually have the debate around whether or not chief executive is a board, chief executive succession into the internal focus thereof is a board issue or not. We would certainly suggest that it is. If you look at the failure rates of externally hired chief executives versus internally hired chief executives, you get twice the failure rate of people brought in from the outside. So we would argue from just a pure risk management perspective, it's incumbent on the board of directors to ensure that the internal pipeline is as robust as it can be. Now, as we covered in the webinar last week, the subscale nature of many organisations, both in New Zealand and in Australia, of course, means that succession is difficult, but there are creative ways of doing it. So we covered some ideas of that in the last webinar, so hopefully that proves a useful reference point. Let's focus for a moment on internal succession. Succession development is something that we would seek to give emphasis to rather than succession planning. So succession planning implies that you can meticulously plan for the movement of your high potentials into executive team roles, special projects, and on to being the next chief executive in 24 months' time. The reality, of course, this is an inherently human process, and people make decisions, people stay longer, leave, and so on. So boards are better off really putting their energy and attention into the succession development, and that can be planned. You can plan which new stretch challenge you give to an executive, which executive development program you can put them on. So these are things in your control. So our advice would be to focus energy on the development rather than meticulous planning. Take great care with timing and communication. So if you set up an internal succession process, maybe announcing that there's 2 potential chief executives too early, that can create some unwanted and unnecessary politics at the executive team table. If done too early, if done too late, you can miss out on the opportunity of having seen your executives perform in different stretch roles ahead of a potential assessment process for their suitability to be the next chief executive. So timing and communication are right, and ensure that your communication is aligned. So you'll have various parties potentially involved in this, commonly an external advisor, but make sure that the objective views of the external advisor, the views of the board, the views of the HR manager who might be involved as well, have an alignment and are not discordant, because that can create huge damage to the organization. Looking externally, most will use an executive search firm for the simple reason that they lack the resources or expertise on the board. Getting alignment across the board members on the strategic context is absolutely key. And the slides that Claire covered earlier give pointers to some tools that can be used in that regard. We talk about challenging on diversity. What we mean on this point here is challenge on the notion that prior industry experience is required. Most commonly when we work with boards through the kind of matrix thinking that we quoted earlier. What ends up being important is actually more the personal attributes and leadership skills of an incoming chief executive, far more than their industry knowledge. Although there is a watch out here that most boards actually quite like talking industry talk with potential candidates, and that can be quite attractive. So again, the importance of making sure that your boards are focusing in their interviews on leadership qualities more than just taking comfort from the fact that someone knows the acronyms of the industry to which the appointment is being made. So most boards will form a committee of some sort to handle the chief executive succession. Some will take it on as a whole board, given the importance of it. So the remuneration committee, nominations committee, appointments committee will be set up. It's really important that these people are chosen because they're close to the business and its culture. Claire made the very important point about the cultural fit versus the cultural add. I mean, how is the committee going to make a judgment call about the desired future culture of the organisation if it doesn't have its finger on the pulse as to what that looks like? Clearly, boards in the last couple of years have gotten closer to organisations, partly through safety walkabouts and so on. But it's absolutely essential that the board has a view of the current culture and indeed the future culture and so on. And lastly, they must have the time. It's absolutely incumbent on these people to devote the sufficient time to what is possibly the most important job that the board will ever do. And just citing two contrasting examples, a private equity firm in Australia we dealt with recently on a chief executive appointment were willing to devote 3 full days to interview the leading 15 prospects for the role. So 3 full days of interviewing effectively what they termed a shortlist. Another board we worked with around the same time actually took 10 weeks from the moment a list of just 3 people was presented to them to actually getting around to interview them. So there are stark differences in the level of attention and time that boards are able to invest. And we would certainly suggest, whilst many won't have the multiple days to interview 15 prospects in one go, that certainly a delay of 10 weeks would be unacceptable. So the Chief Human Resources Officer, both here and studies would support this overseas as well, would be the most commonly left out skill set around the succession process. So typically the boards will all too often, sadly, avoid using the skills of the leading HR expert in the company. Now that person has a difficult role. In a chief executive succession process, the boards are asking them to be a trusted confidant to them, whilst at the same time managing the challenges of being a coach and confidant to the chief executive and other members of the executive team. So, tricky role they have to play, but certainly getting them into a position where they can marshal the process, the succession process, while ultimately the board makes the decision, would certainly be the best use of their skill sets. So executive search, even if there are prospects or a leading prospect potentially internally, many boards will look to test those people against the market and therefore use an executive search firm with that. We would suggest to emphasize, quality versus speed as a selection criteria. The process does take time if done properly, and in fact, from inception to someone starting the role can be a year if you take into account notice periods as well in international relocation, for example. Beware of the off-limits considerations. Many executive searches just fail to reach the level of talent they need to simply on account of the numbers of conflicts of interest the search firm has. And once again, a reminder of the importance of communicating with the internal prospects in an authentic and open way. All too often, there are discordant messages between boards, search firm, and so on. So just a reminder on that one. And lastly, diversity. Test out the search firm's performance on the subject of diversity. Gender is just one dimension. but find out what their performance is. Even if you just simply asked, give the percentage of chief executives that you've appointed who've been female, for example, over the last 5 years, you'll get a pretty good idea as to their level of attention to this very important dimension of search. And then you can make a decision on the basis of whether you wish to partner with them using real data, real metrics like that. Onboarding is the jargon commonly used to talk about the process by which you accelerate a chief executive's performance in role. Beginning perhaps with the handover with the previous chief executive. If the appointee is coming from within, then clearly that's a natural handover period will typically happen with the incumbent chief executive. Coming from outside, what we tend to find is that most very senior chief executives being appointed into organizations favor little or no handover at all with the incumbent. But it's very much a matter of choice. The question of coaching and mentoring support sometimes comes up. We had a recent case of a chair who announced that they weren't happy with having a chief executive appointed who needed coaching. It was an interesting observation. We think that most leading athletes require a coach, in fact, have a coach automatically. And in the case of senior executives, the most successful ones have a strong support network around them that could include coaches and mentors. So we would certainly see the very lonely role that a chief executive can be as being one that's best done with a support team around them. So to summarize some of the thoughts that Claire and I have shared with you over the last half an hour or so, firstly, have a plan. Make sure that the strategy of the organization is the overriding context to any of the work that you do. Devote the time. Use the expertise around you. In particular, the missing piece that we often observe is the role of the leading HR expert in the organization. And make sure you get the balance right between the internal development and the external talent assessment. And what we mean by that, that'll be different for different organizations depending on their context. And lastly, make it a priority. All too often, matters around succession, development, and so on for chief executives are left to any other business at the end of the board meeting. And we would contend this needs to be etched into the board calendar, is put at the front of the board meeting rather than the tail end when everyone's packing up their bags ready to go. We'll be breaking shortly for some questions. And hopefully we'll cover in the content that we've covered thus far and the questions that'll satisfy a lot of your needs. Of course, if you do require further assistance with anything that we've covered, then we're certainly happy to help. And that could be right through from assessment of the board and indeed the board subcommittee in terms of its readiness to take on the chief executive succession challenge. It could be through searching the planet for the best possible chief executive for your organization. It could be in assisting with the development and an assessment of internal prospects for the role. Or lastly, in terms of matching the appointed chief executive with the right coach or mentor to ensure that they succeed. I'm happy to talk to you on any of those subjects. But that's it from me, and I'll pass you now back to Renisa to field the questions.
Many thanks, Claire and Peter. We've had a number of questions and comments come through, and you've both sparked food for thought. Welcome also to Chiwei Kwan. Chiwei leads our leadership solutions practice. He has over 30 years experience in senior roles across government, corporate HR, and leadership consulting firms. Chiwei has worked with senior leaders across the Asia Pacific and continues to be a keen student of leadership. Please welcome Chiwei.
Thank you, Renisa.
To launch our questions, the first one is actually for you, Claire. It is, you talked about starting to think about CEO succession as soon as you appoint a CEO. What is the next best step for a board to take?
Thanks, Renisa, and great question. Just practically, I think the first thing to do is to put it on the agenda. So boards often structure their calendar around an annual strategy day, a number of audit and risk committee meetings. We'd contend that the same ought to happen for chief executive succession planning. So get it on the agenda. And then when it's on the agenda, create a plan. It's a long and involved process. And so it it deserves the attention that the board needs to put to it in thinking about who needs to be involved, the process, the time frame, how often it's going to be discussed. And then, of course, as I mentioned in the presentation, the critical first step is to agree that strategic context. That's the way that all of the rest of the criteria will fall from that. And it's the way to keep the assessment objective at the end of the process when emotions can start to get involved. So that would be my top 3 things to practically get started.
Thanks, Claire. We've had a question come through, Chiwei, for you. I'd love to get your thoughts on this, given the work that you do in developing executives. The question is, what are some of the common pitfalls of internal succession? How do we manage the internal talent pipeline? And do we tell high potentials that they are in line for the CEO role?
Renisa, thank you for the question. And perhaps the way I like to respond to this is I'd like to pick up on something that Peter talked about in terms of internal succession. Peter, if I remember, you talked about the 2 points of communication and timing. Let me just quickly build on that because some of the major common errors I've seen for internal pipeline and succession relates to that. I think the first thing for me that comes to mind in communication is it's often a dilemma as to whether you make it known to the potential successors who might be in line for the top job. And also, what if the chosen one does not eventually get the job and the organization decides to go external? So our advice is, first of all, you need to identify your potential early. And obviously, once you do that, perhaps put in place very targeted development. The flip side of this is we should also be very clear in communication that there's no guarantee that the individuals will get the top job, because it's highly likely that you cannot meet the expectations of everyone. So on the positive side, we think it's important to communicate and tell them that they're being considered because it hopefully gives them the motivation, keep them engaged in terms of staying with the organization. Now, the flip side of not telling the potential successor or successors that might be considered for the top job is the next thing you know, they might hand you a resignation letter because they've been offered an offer they can't refuse by your competitor. And that's when oftentimes organizations realize that, oh, if only I had told him or her before, we might have a very different outcome. So the communication is actually very critical. Now, obviously, at the end of the day, if you decide to go external, then it's important also when it comes to communication that the process is clear, transparent, and the criteria is very open and made known. So your internal would be probably in the consideration, but if it's not selected, it has to be very clear why that's not done. Otherwise, you clearly run the risk of losing your internal talent. I think, Peter, you talked about timing as well. In my experience working with CE succession process, there's often a challenge in terms of how soon do you announce a potential successor, right? And I've seen when you announce a successor way too early, sometimes you get what I call the crown prince syndrome, where you get unintended, undesirable leadership behaviors because the sense of entitlement is there. I would suggest that you only announce who is going to take over once the transition is confirmed and you have a set date. Don't do it too early. And also, underpinning all that, the criteria may change. So assuming you have an internal talent pipeline of say 1, 2, perhaps 3 potential successors, it's also critically important, I feel, that you constantly evaluate the external operating environment because the criteria may have changed in terms of the skills you need for the successor. Second thing I'll definitely check for in an internal talent pipeline is you need to make sure that they continue to deliver on performance on an annual basis. So make sure you, as a board or as a subcommittee, you constantly review the external operating environment, review the performance of your talent pipeline. And if you don't do these well, often your internal talent process falls over.
Thank you, Chiwei. It's interesting, the example you've just shared. There's a case study that the University of Auckland published, I think it was in the 2018 Journal of Management and Organisation that we were looking at in research around Air New Zealand. And it conducted interviews with the board, the incumbents, and it tracked the journey from John Palmer appointing Sir Ralph Norris to Rob Fife to Christopher Luxon. And they did some of the things that you've just described. So they told the internal potential successors that they were in the running, and they were afforded secondments, mentoring, coaching. However, it was never said that it was a done deal. And when it actually came time, they did do a competitive process and run a search as well, despite the fact that ultimately the internal was the successor. So it's interesting in terms of a case study. And then at the Be Bold conference last year, Jolie Hodson spoke, and she was very open about the fact that Spark, deliberately the board gave her secondments to broaden out her skill set in her grooming to take on the CEO role. So there are a lot of examples around us where we can see that happen in practice as well. The next question I'd love to ask both Peter and Claire, but we might start with you first, Peter. It's in the work that you do with boards, what typically trips up the CEO succession process?
There's a number of things. I think probably the number one is not spending enough time on it. So in other words, that it becomes sadly a panic buy at the last minute when a chief executive departs. I think, as Claire alluded to, not taking control of the process. We've also seen a number of examples. Chiwe talked about the politics of internal appointees. I think sometimes boards fail to communicate in a way that is helpful with some of their internal candidates. On one occasion, we observed an organization who'd spent 2 years developing their internal, only to let them down at the end because they didn't have prior chief executive experience. So suddenly this criteria had suddenly mysteriously emerged into the picture, and they were excluded from the chief executive appointment on the basis they lacked the chief executive experience, which was clumsy, unfortunate, and led to a very disenfranchised senior executive. So I'd probably leave it at that for the moment, and maybe Claire's got some other ideas.
Yeah, actually, Peter, just building on that point, I think, we often find boards will get caught up with the focus on the tried and tested chief executives as opposed to a first-time chief executive. One of the processes that we concluded recently, actually, it came down to two individuals, both external, but one very much a tried and tested chief executive, high profile in the market, versus another that was a first-time chief executive. And that scenario really actually demonstrated the importance of paying attention to what some might call some of the softer skills, and the aptitude and the value of psychometric testing in that process. In this particular scenario, the board were very excited about the tried and tested chief executive right from the beginning, but the testing of the psychometrics demonstrated that the personality profile, the values alignment, the learning agility were actually far better aligned in the first-time chief executive than they were in the tried and tested. And fortunately, through that, the board decided to go with the first-time chief executive, but it really just shows the value of making sure that it's a thorough assessment process.
Yeah, Peter, I'm just curious because in a lot of the work we do, and I think we get thrown this question a lot, weighing up industry experience and tried and tested, deep content expert, deep industry knowledge versus the soft skills. Because in some of the work I've done with senior leaders, I think for me at the end it boils down to a couple of what you might call differentiating leadership competencies. And so for me, a couple of things come to mind that defines the potential to be successful. And it comes down to a few things. One, it's what I call the ability to deal with ambiguity. The second point is the ability to be agile and learn. The third one is about humility. And the fourth is curiosity. Because in the execs that I worked with, if they come to the table with this mindset, regardless of how deep the industry expertise is, they are able to pick it up very quickly. And this is where I've seen leaders being much more inclusive, being a servant leader mentality versus I come in with my deep industry expertise and I'll tell you this is what's best for the organization. So I'm really curious, what's our take on industry versus the soft skills based on the assignments you did?
Yeah. Anyway, thank you. It's a great point. And I would certainly contend that oftentimes boards do take comfort from someone who can talk the industry versus deeper diving into the leadership attributes that you talked about. Something else also come to mind that I hope is also instructive. I think a lot of boards do leave their chief executive succession process too much to their chief executive. I reflect on an exercise that we conducted a while back where we shared our initial research on a particular chief executive appointment to the incumbent chief executive as at the request of the board, and the chief executive basically put a line through the whole thing and said, go back to the drawing board. There's no one here that could possibly do the job, and of course, that led to a big delay in the process. It sort of upset the apple cart somewhat. And of course, the individual on the front page of that report was then subsequently appointed. But it was an example, I suppose, of a case where the board probably put too much trust in the judgment of the chief executive around their succession at that point. And it served to derail things somewhat.
Just to add on there, I think it's interesting points that you made, Chi-Wei, focusing in on some of the more leadership characteristics. And actually, I think perhaps boards may fail to sort of think about this in the broader context. So what does the chief executive as the leader need to bring versus what can be found available within the organization itself, or even from buying in? It's much easier to buy in some expertise around an industry in the form of consulting, or looking to other people in the organization for that. It's much harder to buy in humility, learning agility, and so forth. So I think it's just really important to focus in on what the priorities are there.
Thank you all. Really insightful comments coming through. And the next theme of questions have been repeated by a number of participants, so I'll group them together. They are regarding how a board should practically go about framing meeting external CEO candidates when it can take a long time for the CEO's replacement, and around that external talent mapping. What practical advice can we give them on how to go about it? Who among you would like to have a go at this question first?
I'm happy to just venture an answer there. I think as the research would concur, we've through our involvement with the business school IMD and Professor Didier Cossin there, the research that he's done in the North American market that we quoted, would show that roughly 2/3 of American businesses are interviewing external prospects each year. Now, that's very seldom done in this market, we would suggest. And I'm sure there's a whole lot of reasons around that. We're a very small talent pool, issues around the village, and so on. But what we would suggest is that there needs to be no expectation set. It can literally be a coffee meeting. The board can be entirely happy with the performance of its chief executive, and yet equally, at the same time, be attentive to their desire to know who else is out there. Those two concepts can be held together. And we would also suggest it's best done transparently with the incumbent chief executive. It's a part of the duty of the board to make sure it has backup plans, not just backup plans if a critical piece of IT infrastructure fails, but critical backup plans if a piece of your critical human infrastructure fails. So I think best done openly, best done with no expectations set, transparently with the current chief executive, so he or she doesn't find out through another route that the board chair or board committee was seen having dinner with a potential candidate or whatever. So it's all done openly, but it is the duty of the chief executive, it is the duty of the board, and I think sometimes boards can tiptoe a little bit around the sensitivities of their chief executive in this regard. So even just putting succession planning on the agenda can send the bristles up with your chief executive. So it's something to bear in mind, but our view is that the board should venture on regardless.
Thank you. I'll move to the next question. And it's come up a couple of times. It's tips on managing risks around unsuccessful internal candidates. And it's interesting because we've peppered through, some learnings around that. But if you had to give, your top recommendations on managing those risks, what would those be? Perhaps start with you this time, Chiwei, and feel free for the rest of the panel to chip in and add your thoughts too.
Sure, Renisa, thank you. I think I kind of partly addressed that in terms of the common pitfalls. I think the big thing is always, creating false expectations that the individuals is going to get the job in X months or years. Because once you do that, it's very hard to backtrack. So I think, again, going back to what I would consider good practice in terms of communication, that, yeah, you might have 2 or 3 that are in line, put them through targeted development and reinforce the point that you need to still deliver on your day job and not think about 2 years from now, you're going to get there, right? And eventually, when the process comes up, the criteria, as I say, has to be transparent. If you go external, that's all good. Now, in the end, there's only one top job, and there will be 1, 2, perhaps 3 internally that won't get that. I think this is where it's important to continue to reinforce, if it's true, that they still have a significant contribution to make to the organization. And this is where you need to front foot that, knowing that 1 or 2 might not get it, right? It's only one job. And engage them early before they decide to throw in the towel once the announcement is made. So, and sometimes organizations might give them a really plum role that to head up a startup project, send them for a nice executive program in terms of broadening the horizons. But the important thing is communicate that they still have a role, a key role to contribute. And for all you know, they might not get it this time around, but 3 years down the road, they might need the front runner to get that. So it comes back to being clear and transparent with the communication. Having said all that, you might end up losing them, and that's without a doubt, right? If they can't get a top job here, they might get it across the road, and that's just reality. But if it's talent worth keeping, then you need to invest the time to make sure it's clearly communicated.
Yeah, I just build on that, actually. I mean, Chiwei, you emphasize the transparency there. I'd also emphasize the objectivity of the criteria as well. I think that a lot of times what we come up against, particularly in the work that we do around board evaluations and looking at board dynamics, is very much a focus on relationships. And that's obviously a very Kiwi thing. But it's really got to be important that we're depersonalizing these things and looking at objective criteria and how different people have measured up or otherwise against that. And that's the best way to maintain a long-term relationship in the communication of sometimes, hard to hear feedback.
Thank you, Claire. Interesting, this theme's coming through from participants as well. There's a follow-up question, Peter, to your comment around sometimes seeing CEO succession planning on the agenda can get the bristles up for the chief executive. And the question is, how do you engage and work with the incumbent without creating tension?
I think part of it is perhaps just the starting point really is explaining to the chief executive that the responsibility of the board is fundamentally to make sure that not only do they have a high-performing chief executive in post, but should that person leave at some point in the future, to be ready with a solution to find someone else in the future. And I think it really does come down to just sitting down, having an objective conversation. It is a difficult one. Chief executives don't like the idea that the board is, or commonly don't like the idea that the board is making plans for their possible departure. But that's the reality. All chief executives eventually will leave their organization, and the board need to be in a state of readiness for that.
Peter, what I've also seen done really well is oftentimes part of the KPI of the chief executive is to develop his or her successor. And in the regular board meetings, the incumbent needs to present who are his or her top 3 talent that might succeed the individual. And also describe to the board, what are we doing to develop these 1, 2, or 3 individuals so that they might be ready in 2, 3, 5 years' time. And so I think, Renisa, if for me, it comes back to communication. If the expectations are clear, and it's actually part of the incumbent's role to develop a successor, then, that's the role of the job. That's part of the role of the job.
Yeah, thank you. There's a big theme that's come through, and it is a biggie. So I think it might take us a couple of minutes to collectively answer it. And broadly, it's the theme of internal versus external. and the merits of one over the other. And there's a variety of questions that have come through as subsets of that to give you a flavor. One of them is, given long notice periods and restraints of trade applicable to CEOs, how do boards avoid being limited to just internal candidates or what's available in the market? And then the higher level question that I think we should start with first is just generally, what are the merits of one over the other? So keen to get the whole panel's perspectives on this. Might start with you, Peter, in the first instance, and then feel free to add in everyone.
Of course, we've discussed that internal candidates are less likely to fail. So that's a starting point. But typically, if the internal candidate idea is generally favoured in situations where the strategy of the organisation is not changing. And that's seen as an easier place to put an internal, easier context to put an internal appointed chief executive into. Generally where you're looking for a step shift in some way, a shift in strategy, a shift in emphasis of the organization, breaking into different markets and so on, shifting gear in some way, maybe moving from a customer excellence focused model to operational excellence or the other way around. In those cases, typically we're looking for an injection of external talent. And it partly comes down to that notion that we repeated a couple of times in the presentation about the cultural add that you might get by bringing in an external leader from an organization who exemplified that kind of DNA. So that would be a factor.
I guess, Renissa, the only thing I'll add, and I think we've covered some of these points earlier, is oftentimes organizations have to go external because there's no strong internal pipeline. So it goes back to the point I think Claire made, that it can't be a panic buy. If it is, you probably end up going external because you don't have an option. But if you have an option, then to Peter's point, it's really back to strategy and what you need in competencies. If it exists internally, by all means, promote from within. If it doesn't exist, then logically, you need to go outside, right?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, just building on Peter's point there, there are other scenarios also where we've looked at bringing in external people because there isn't the internal pipeline. I can remember a chief executive succession process we did a number of years now for a local business that, whilst it was based in New Zealand, the majority of its customers and business was overseas. And there'll be many examples of this in our local market. And so in order to have somebody that was going to have that global perspective and global reach, it was necessary to bring somebody in from outside. But in this particular instance, we combed the globe and managed to find an individual that was a Kiwi but happened to be residing in Canada, I think, at the time. So it was a good mix, I guess, of the organisation feeling some level of cultural affinity, given that it was a Kiwi, but bringing in that external and global perspective of somebody that had worked for many years overseas.
So Claire, so sorry to jump in, but you see, if I look at this from a talent management perspective, and if I know that I need a CE for a New Zealand business that has a global mindset, if I know this 3 years ago, I would look at my internal pipeline and maybe identify the one individual and make sure I focus on very targeted exposure and development. Then I don't have to go external, right? So again, it's back to, do we actually have a deliberate planned effort to look at succession? Otherwise, you're absolutely right, because the talent pool here is relatively small. If you need someone who has experienced an entry market into China, in Southeast Asia, and somewhere, you're not going to get them today if you haven't built them internally.
And also, I suppose, building on last week's webinar, where we talked about making sure that we're being creative about development opportunities. And it may be that, there aren't the opportunities within an organization to develop the pipeline to the way that they would like. And in those cases, maybe looking at outside secondments, thinking about the pathway for an individual doesn't have to be continually within the company. It could be out and then back in order to make that sort of leap into the next level.
So Claire, sorry, for me, that's very pertinent for New Zealand, given that we're primarily an SME economy. And oftentimes I get challenged that we don't have the resources to develop people, to send them for fancy programs all over the world. But again, as you said, if you're targeted and focused, it need not cost you an arm and a leg, but you are developing something very specific, and be creative about that. But that's probably a topic for another webinar.
Thank you all. We love live feedback, and we've had a comment from a participant that we've made no mention of an interim CEO solution, and any comments or thoughts around how that could be managed.
Yeah, look, it's a great comment. So thank you, whoever sent that in. I think particularly given sometimes the abrupt nature of the departure of some chief executives, and then combined with that the time it takes to appoint a new chief executive, which we talked about being up to a year, then often an interim is required. In some cases, that's an internal person who takes on a caretaker role. In some cases, that's all that the board specifically wants an internal person that has no designs on the top role, to allow for them to sort of step back from the process at the very end. Other times, the board actually sees it as the opportunity for a proving ground for an internal person to step into the role for 6 months while the search process is underway. So there's also the role of the expert interim chief executive, an external person who's been there, done it, chief executive, who can, I guess, preside over matters in the interim period. So certainly is a commonly used tool, and certainly has merit.
Thank you. In a similar vein, we've got a comment to share our views on a topic as opposed to a specific question. And it's regarding our view on board members stepping into the CEO role and what process should be followed there.
It's certainly something that we've seen in the market. It's I think the challenge is for some is actually we've observed is they're often going on an interim basis and then quite like it for a number of reasons. That maybe that harks back to an earlier executive career they had. It's also potentially the money, and then they suddenly get comfortable and find themselves sort of comfortably ensconced in this role, when actually, if the board go back to the full criteria they were looking to appoint to, that they might not have matched that. And that, I think, is a danger. And then the board, are left with this difficult political and emotional decision around, okay, we've so-and-so stepped into the role. We're grateful for them doing that. Now they're getting a little bit too comfortable. It kind of didn't really meet exactly what we were trying to achieve in the first place. It's suboptimal, but we'll deal with it. We'll just live with it. That's the risk.
Thank you, Peter. I'm conscious of time, so we'll wrap up. Our apologies, we couldn't answer all the questions that have come through. Thank you so much for the input, and we will follow some of these up either in future webinars or through phone calls with you, or by taking the conversation online to LinkedIn, as we have done in the past. In our closing, we'd also love to invite you to all our upcoming webinars. We will be moving to a fortnightly cadence instead of our recent weekly webinars. Thank you to everyone who has suggested topics. We've gathered that data and we will develop a pipeline accordingly. Our next webinar will be on Thursday, May 28, on the topic, Developing Executives, Lessons from the Front Line, drawing on insights from coaching, workshops with senior leaders, and more. The following fortnight, on June 11, our webinar will be on high-performing boards. Registrations are now open on our website, and we will also email an invitation. We would also be grateful if you could please fill out a short survey for feedback on this webinar. We'll send an email with the link. If you enjoyed today's session and found it thought-provoking, we will eventually develop this topic into a one-day workshop with global thought leaders. Please keep an eye out for that event in due course. And most importantly, we want to thank our team behind the scenes, who over the last 3 weeks in lockdown have made these webinars possible, experimenting with technology and innovating solutions. Thank you so much, Amelia and Paul. And we look forward to staying connected online or in person when the time allows. Until then, please stay safe. Kia kaha.